Filter Suite version 2.0 webinar. Maybe we will allow just for 1-2 minutes for more people to join, and then we will start. Now that some people have joined, I think will be good to start. Okay, so hello everyone, welcome to the WWF Risk Filter Suite version 2.0 webinar. I'm Isabel Mesa, and I have the pleasure to start speaking with you today. I'm the manager for research and development within the Risk Filter Suite tool. And today we will introduce you about the tool for those that are not familiar with, but also we will explain all the changes we have done within this version 2.0. The version and what was the difference between the version 1.0. This version 2.0 was released 2 weeks ago on October 15. And I just would like to say, in case you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. We have our other experts answering these questions, so we can ensure most of them are answered. Don't put anything in the chat because it's difficult for us to keep track. So if you have a question, post it in the Q&A session. We will try to answer the most as we can in writing. Of course, at the end of the webinar, we will leave some time to answer the questions live. And don't worry, we are recording the webinar. We will share with you this session, the materials, and any unanswered Q&As, we will take it with us, and we will also share it with you when we share all the materials. So with this and without further ado, let's start with this webinar. So can we go next, please? Thanks a lot. What we are going to see today, or the agenda that we are going to walk you through today, is first an introduction about the Risk Filter Suite. Then we will speak about the updates that we did in the Risk Filter Suite tools about water and biodiversity risk filter. Then we're going to jump to the data and methods, and finally to discuss some further materials, and then allow time for this Q&A session. Next, please. Okay, and let's start with what is the Risk Filter Suite. The Risk Filter Suite compiles free, online, and special explicit tools. This means these tools need geographic locations, and they also provide you with some visualizations like maps. The Risk Filter Suite hosts the biodiversity risk filter and the water risk filter. The water risk filter has more than 10 years of experience, and the biodiversity risk filter was launched last year, so it also has already a year of experience at least. Both are corporate and portfolio level screening and prioritization tools. They help to prioritize where and on what to focus their corporate actions and inform business and strategy and investment decision-making process. The tools are mainly designed for corporates and financial institutions. And as you can see in the bottom line, we have already experience working with different industries. For instance, financial institutions, retail industries, textile and apparel. We have over 70,000 users registered in our tool, and so far more than 2 million sites has been assessed. Next, please. And maybe you're wondering why WWF is doing this. Well, within WWF, we have the Water and Biodiversity Stewardship Hubs, And they actually have this business transformation framework, which it goes around, as you can see, to assess, embed, implement, and advocate. The Risk Filter Suite helps in this business transformational framework because it enables and assists corporations and financial institutions to assess water biodiversity risk and opportunities. Also, it supports companies and financial institutions to embed this fresh water and biodiversity into their strategy. And well, just to know how we do this, the risk assessment framework that we have. And before going on this, I just want to speak with you just to show you some acronyms that you will see across the presentation. So every time you see WRF, we are referring to the water risk filter. BRF is the biodiversity risk filter. And every time you see an RFS, it means risk filter suite. So just keep this in mind because now to shorten, we will also use these three acronyms across the presentation. So the first part is different corporates activities are impacting biodiversity and water resources and depend on ecosystem services to different degrees. That's why the water risk filter and the biodiversity risk filter needs to know the industry of the sites and apply different weightings. The water risk filter is doing it using a percentage, and the biodiversity risk filter is aligned mainly with ONCORE. The other part that we need to know is the state of water and biodiversity. It's necessary to know and assess the different aspects and challenges between water and biodiversity across the globe. And because biodiversity or water resources are extremely location specific, it's super important to know where are you located or where is the site located to know what is the state of water and biodiversity. At the moment, within the water risk filter, we have 42 global data sets to inform this. And with the biodiversity risk filter, more than 50 data sets. This is what we provide with the tool, but now what the user need to input in the tools. The user need to input the coordinates to identify this state of water and biodiversity. It need to input the industry, which is in the left side, and also need to input the business importance just to allow for prioritization. At the end, we combine the information on this impact and dependency on biodiversity, these weightings and water, and also we calculate this state of water and the pressures that biodiversity and water resources are facing at the specific location. And it will give you this, the different water or biodiversity risk ratings for the site locations. And we also provide these results in three different risk types. The physical risk, which it has to do with where are you located, in which basin or marine areas, if you're located in areas that are already experiencing water and biodiversity challenges. For instance, for water, we assess if there is either too much water, too little water, or if the water is unfit for use. In the biodiversity, we are assessing within the physical risk if there is a decline in ecosystem services, or if the industry is heavily dependent or impacting ecosystems for their activities. The regulatory risk, it has to do with if your site is operating in an unstable or poorly managed or implemented regulatory environment. And the reputational risk has to do with if stakeholders and local communities are perceiving that the company or this corporate or industry is conducted business in a sustainable and responsible way. And we use some indicators, for instance, for this reputational risk, like media scrutiny or protected areas. I just want to flag here that the water risk filter is doing the assessment through the three risk types, and biodiversity risk filter at the moment is only for physical and reputational, but we are working on regulatory risk assessment that we hope to be launched within the next years. And before I hand over to my colleague Liam to walk you through the data updates, I would just want to close with this overview on what is and what is not the Risk Filter Suite. Is a nature-related risk tool that will help you to assess this nature-related risk to business, and is a corporate and portfolio level screening and prioritization tool. Is not, and we cannot cover with the data sets we have, a full comprehensive model that will assess all the nature-related risk to nature and people. So if you use the tool, please be aware that we cannot cover all the different nuances and all the differences and the full spectrum of water and biodiversity. Also, it's not a footprint assessment. We do not provide in the biodiversity or water risk filter impact scores. And finally, The tool is not done to do a site level assessments, because we use these global data sets and we use these basins that it is just only helping to prioritize. But if you want to know super local information, you will need better granular data and more near real-time information. And with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Liam.
All right. Thank you very much, Isa. So hi, everyone. I'm Liam Bailey. I'm the geospatial analyst for the Risk Filter Suite team. So I'm now going to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the changes that we've made with these updates to the Risk Filter Suite, focusing on both the side of water and biodiversity. This is going to be a broad overview. We're not going to get into detail about all the specific data sets that have changed. We'll talk a little bit later about our methodology page, our data and methods page, and if you want to get into finer detail on the changes, you can go into that. So we'll give you a bit of detail about that later on. So before I talk about the specific tools, I just want to talk about why we are doing these updates. What's the benefit of doing these updates? So there are a number of benefits we see in having these updates done semi-regularly. I think one important thing for us is that it allows us to integrate user feedback, and that makes sure that the tool is providing the best possible option for people to assess and prioritize their risks. It also allows us to take advantage of new data that may have been released over the last few years, and this gives us a few benefits. Firstly, it allows us to assess new types of risk that we might not have been able to do before. It can also allow us to better assess risks that we were already focusing on by using new, updated, and more recent data sets. And of course, it also makes sure that we can have the newest versions of data that have been recently released. So data sets that are being constantly maintained, we want to make sure that we're keeping updated with the newest versions of those data. So I first want to talk about the changes we've made to the water risk filter, and this will be the larger of the two parts, and that's because the biodiversity risk filter is still a fairly new part of our tool, and so we didn't want to do large changes to it at this stage. It's still a fairly recent addition. The water risk filter, on the other hand, has had some larger changes, so I'll spend a bit more time talking about that. This slide here gives you a broad overview of data changes that we've made in the back end of the water risk filter. We've had some data sets that have been replaced, some have removed, some new data sets added, and in some cases, some new data, some data where we've updated it with newer versions. Some of the data sets we've replaced include data on corruption and access to safe drinking water. And I just want to emphasize here again that this does not mean that we're not assessing these. It means that we've replaced existing data with newer data that we think better achieves the goals of assessing risks on these topics. We've had 10 data sets removed from the water risk filter. This includes cultural diversity and projected change in drought occurrence. A number of the data sets that we've removed are related to reputational risk, and that's because we've had some changes to reputational risk to better align between our water risk and biodiversity risk tools, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Specifically, the projected change in drought and also projected change in flood occurrence, we've removed from the tool because we want our water risk filter tool to focus on estimating current risk, and we have our scenarios section of the tool which is more focused on projecting future changes in risk. So we wanted to separate out the tasks of those two tools a little bit more explicitly. In terms of data sets that we've added, as you see here, there's 24 new data sets that have been included, but I think 2 that are quite valuable and that have been brought up by user feedback are the inclusion of groundwater and plastic pollution, which we commonly get questions about in the past. And we've made updates to some of the data, including changes to baseline water stress, which now aligns with the World Resources Institute Aqueduct 4.0 release. And we've also updated data on estimated flood occurrence.
I'm now answering it.
Okay. So we've updated the data sets in the back, but in the case of the water risk filter, we've also changed a little bit of the structure of how we aggregate risk. So for those of you that might not be so familiar with the water risk filter, the way that our method works is that we take data sets and we convert these into indicators, which range from risk scores of 1 to 5. And we then aggregate these up into risk categories where we have similar indicators grouped together, and then further into risk types. So one of the big things that we've changed is that we now have 2 separate risk categories, one for water availability and one for drought. And these were previously combined together into a category called water scarcity. And we've done this again based on user feedback, but also because we're more convinced now that drought is a unique risk that needs to be assessed separately from other indicators of water scarcity. As I mentioned previously, we've also made some changes to how we structure reputational risk in the water risk filter, and that's these areas in yellow on the right of your screen. And we've compiled together some of the previous risk categories to make sure that we're now structuring reputational risk in a similar way between our water and biodiversity risk filter tools. I just want to point out that there are some data sets that have been maintained or kept in the tool, but they may be moved into different categories. I'm not going to go into detail about all of these smaller changes, but as we'll talk about a little bit later in our data and methods section, we have a specific document which is dedicated to these data updates. So you can have a look at this to get a little bit more detail on the changes that we've made. So I mentioned before the idea of us separating out the tasks of the main water risk filter part of the tool and the scenarios part of the tool. We have updated the part of the tool that's estimating current risk, but we haven't made any changes to the scenarios section of the tool. And scenarios is intended to allow users to estimate change in risk under different emissions and social development pathways. And because we haven't made changes to scenarios section of the tool, this does mean that the structure of the categories and scenarios will not align directly with the other parts of the water risk filter. However, the scenarios section of the tool can still be used independently if your focus is on assessing changes in risk or predicted changes in risk in the future. For those of you that might have used the water risk filter before, you may also know that we have an operational questionnaire, which you can use to provide a little bit more detail on operational characteristics of your sites. This is still included in the water risk filter and has not been changed, so it will be the same as previously in our version 1.0. One other important thing to note about the water risk filter is our removal of local data sets. In our previous versions, we had access to local downscaled data for a number of countries and regions around the globe. Unfortunately, with these changes, these older local data sets are now misaligned and need a bit of maintenance. And this is something that we've now passed on to our relevant WWF network officers, who we feel are better placed on the ground to be working on this type of data and trying to maintain it in the future. You can see on the map here the areas where we have network officers maintaining the data going forward. And if you're interested in finding more about this, you can contact these network officers and get a little bit more detail, especially if you may be dealing with sites that are all in one country, which our tool is not very well designed to deal with. The final topic with the water risk filter that I want to discuss is our alignment with the Science Based Targets Network. For those that don't know, Science Based Targets Network, or SBTN, is a framework that helps companies set scientifically credible targets to try and minimize their impacts on nature. And it's becoming a really common target setting initiative with activities in over 30 countries. And because this is becoming much more important and prevalent, we wanted to make sure that our tools are better aligned with SBTN. In 2023, our team, along with the World Resources Institute and the SBTN, put together a unified risk layer that can be used to assess water availability and water quality risks, And this helps support both step 1 and step 2 as part of the SPTM process. In conjunction with the changes that we're making to the Risk Filter Suite now, we've also updated this unified layer to make sure that it is using the newest available data from the World Resources Institute using Aqueduct 4.0. So this is one thing that's happening at the same time as these changes to our tool. And as we change the water risk filter, we've also made sure that the data that's included in these unified risk layers that's relevant for SPTN is now also included in our water risk filter. So this means that all of these relevant data sets can be accessed by doing an assessment in the water risk filter. And as we'll mention a little bit later, we also have templates that can help you convert the outputs from the Risk Filter Suite into output that's useful for SPTN. Okay, so now I want to move and talk a little bit about the biodiversity risk filter. As I mentioned, the changes here are a little bit less, simply because this is a newer part of our risk filter suite. Again, we have some data sets that have been changed. We've replaced data on wildfires and labour rights violation, among others, to use some better data that we think has more robust methods. We've removed 3 data sets, including violence against land and environmental defenders and governance. Again, a lot of this relates to our restructuring of reputational risk. In the particular case of land and environmental defenders, this is data that we didn't feel comfortable making public in case it endangers people on the ground. So this is something that we've decided to remove from the tool. Again, we've had data that we've added, and here plastic pollution is another key addition, which we think is very important. And because the biodiversity risk filter assesses risks in marine areas as well as in terrestrial and freshwater habitats, we've been able to include data on both marine plastic pollution and mismanaged plastic on land. And finally, we've made some updates for data sets where we have newer versions of the data. Now, as part of this process, changing both water and biodiversity, we've tried to achieve greater alignment between our risk filter suite tools. And we now have approximately 24 data sets that are shared between water and biodiversity, which equates to almost 60% and around 40% of the unique data sets used in the 2 tools. So why do we think this is important? Well, our goal here is that in biodiversity risk filter, when we're assessing risks related to water, we want to make sure that they're informed by the best practices that we're using inside the water risk filter, and vice versa. And it also makes sure that the narratives and the meaning of the risk between the 2 tools is more easily understandable. So for example, we have estimations of risk related to water availability in both the water risk and biodiversity risk filter. And you can interpret those risk scores in a similar way because they use similar underlying data sets. However, I want to be clear here that just because we're using the same or similar data sets between the 2 tools, it does not mean that we're going to get identical risk scores if you assess your sites in both of these tools. And this is because of a range of different reasons. Firstly, we process the data slightly differently between the 2 tools, and this is so that we can make sure we're focusing on either biodiversity-specific risks or water-specific risks. We also aggregate the risks a bit differently between the tools. As an example, in biodiversity risk filter, our estimates of pollution risk deal with both freshwater and terrestrial pollution, whereas in the water risk filter, we are only focusing on pollution in freshwater ecosystems. And finally, as my colleague Isabel mentioned before, the way that we weight our risk scores to make them industry specific is also slightly different between our 2 tools. So this is a reason why you might see some slightly different risk scores between the 2 tools. So I want to move on now and just talk broadly about the changes in RFS and give you some general advice when using the tool. So as of 2 weeks ago, the website is now running the newest version of the Risk Filter Suite. So if you go on there and you assess risks for your sites, you'll be getting risks that use this new structure that we've been talking about today. It's important to point out that we have made a number of changes, as you've seen, to the data sets underlying the tools, and we are not intending for this new version of the Risk Filter Suite to be comparable to the scores that you might have got before. This is intended to be an update to make the risks more robust, reliable, and expansive in the future. It's not intended as a comparison to previous scores. And just to emphasize that point, it means that you shouldn't be using scores you might have had before and scores that you might get now as an estimate of risk change. It's not intended for that purpose. Within the Risk Filter Suite, when we've done these updates, one other thing that's important to know is that we now have a limit of 5,000 sites per account that can be geocoded. Now, geocoding is the process of converting address information into coordinates. This is something that we previously had provided an unlimited access to for all users. But as the number of users in the tool has increased substantially over the past years, this has become untenable. So we now have a limit for each user that they can geocode or convert addresses to coordinates for 5,000 sites on their account. If you are dealing with data where you have more than 5,000 addresses that you need to convert, we've included some advice in our data and methods section that explains how you might be able to go about doing that yourself. And also, as with before, be aware that our tool is only intended to assess up to 5,000 sites per company. So please keep that in mind when you're using the online tool. Another important thing is our country profiles. These were released a little while ago, but I wanted to highlight them again today. So we now have country profiles for both water and biodiversity, and the methods for how we created these country profiles is described in our methodology documents. These country profiles can be useful, but we should see them as a rough estimate of average national risk. The aggregation of risk to a single country level can be a little bit uncertain, especially when you're dealing with large countries. So it should be seen as a rough idea of national risk. And that means that if you want to be doing robust risk estimation and prioritization, you should be conducting this using site level data, which is what our tool is designed to work with. So just to finish off and summarize what I've been talking about today. So to summarize the changes, we've now included a number of new data sets in both water and biodiversity risk filter and updated some data sets where relevant. Inside the water risk filter, this also means that we've changed a little bit of the structure. So there are slightly different risk categories to what you may have seen before. Unfortunately, we've needed to remove the local data sets from the tool, but these have been passed over to our WWF network offices and hope that these will be maintained further in the future. And as we've made these changes, we've also tried to achieve greater alignment between water and biodiversity, so it's a bit easier to understand risks that are shared between the two tools. And as I mentioned for SBTN, we've tried to make sure we have better alignment with large international frameworks. SBTN is one example, but also ESRS CSRD, which is another one that we've been trying to align with better or provide advice on. So that's the summary of the changes that we've made. And now I want to hand it back to Isabel to talk a little bit about the data and methods and the further materials. And these data and methods will be particularly important if you want to dig a little bit deeper into our changes.
Many thanks, Liam. So yes, as Liam said, let's go with the data and methods. This page is super important because we created a new data and methods page. In the past, we used to have one specifically for biodiversity, one specifically for water. Now we decided to do only one page, but also separate the methodology into documents to make it easier for you to find relevant information. And also, I would like to flag that everything we have said today, everything you've seen in this presentation is described in this data and methods page. And because this is new and we just separate many documents, we would like to walk you through them. The first part we have, and this is highly recommended if you are new to the Risk Filter Suite and then you don't know where to start, or you want to know more about it. These are the documents and the section where you need to go. We have created the RFS 101 guidance, and also we have different tutorials. We have PDF tutorials, we have video tutorials, and we also created a web page tutorial, which if you click next, please, Liam. Yeah, we also have this webpage tutorial where you can go. There is also steps in what you need to do, how you can upload data, how you can share data. So everything is in there, is free to access. Just to say, everything everyone could access. Only if you want to assess your risk and you will upload data, then you need to create an account, because it's to protect your data. But otherwise, all the other parts of the tool, they are open, also data and methods, so you can go there even if you don't have an account. We also separated the biodiversity risk filter documents and the water risk filter, and you can find both of them in the same area. And there you can find the methodology that we follow to do the aggregation, to do all the conversion from raw data to our risk scores. Also, there is the indicator documentation, so you can go there and read more about what it means with every indicator we have, what is the raw data sets. Also, there is an indicator summary, so if you don't want to read the whole information, you can go to the summary. And finally, there is an interpretation guidance for biodiversity risk filter and water risk filter, so how to interpret the results and the different indicators that we have in there. We also have creating some guidance on location data. So this is particularly important for financial institutions and very big companies that they don't know how to get location data, or they need to get asset level data sets. Here we provided this guidance in how you can get more data. And also if they want, or any financial institution or big company wants to aggregate their data because it has many companies and you want to know in your final portfolio, here are some ideas in how you can do it. We also created some technical guidance. This has been launched since last year in how the Risk Filter Suite aligns with international frameworks and with other initiatives. For instance, we have technical guidance for SBTN, the science-based targets for nature, as Liam already presented. We also have for the Task Force on nature-related financial disclosures, and recently for the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And on this one, I would like to dive deep a little bit, just to let you know what we have in this guidance. For the SBTN, we have a technical guidance specifically on step 1 and 2, which is where our tools can help the most. So there is a technical guidance, but it's also an Excel template that will help you to translate the results you're getting from the tool to what is required by the SBTN. The TNFD is mainly focusing the technical guidance on the LEAP approach. The LEAP approach means locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. So we are showing what are the linkages between the Risk Filter Suite to the different stages of this LEAP approach. We also have there a technical guidance and an Excel template that will help you to identify which indicators will help you to answer some disclosure metrics. And finally, we just launched last month the technical guidance in how the Risk Filter Suite can help with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, specifically in these European Sustainability Reporting Standards, focusing in the E3, which is for water and marine resources, and E4, biodiversity and ecosystems. And we also have a technical guidance for this. I just want to add that we try to align. However, our tools also won't cover all the requirements for all of these. So we are just showing in which part we can support. If you are very interested in this CSRD ESRS, we will highly recommend you to go back and read the SBTN and read the TNFD, because the ESRS is recommending to use SBTN to set ecological thresholds, so to use the methodology from SBTN, but also to use the TNFD LEAP approach to do disclosures. So if you want to focus on this, we highly recommend you to also go to the other two. And in the final part we have in our data and methods is some additional information that might help you. We have created an industry sector classification that will help you if you have the information for your industries using any different international classification like ESIC, NACE, GIGS. It's just to show you how you can translate these to our industries that the RFS has. Also, we have provided already all the documentation. Liam already walked you through this, that we have this document with all the information in what has been updated, what has been changed. You can find in this RFS data updates documentation. We also created a geocoding advice. As Liam said, now the tool is only allowed to transform 5,000 addresses. And this geocoding advice will help you if you have all the information in addresses, how can you convert them to latitude and longitude to coordinates? We also have an FAQs. So we highly recommend you, if you have questions, maybe these are already answered there. So please go to this document, read the FAQs, and maybe you will have already the answers to your questions. And finally, we also created a glossary so you are aware of what are our key terms. And I would like also to flag to you some additional resources we have. But before that, as I already said, we have some, the tool is free tool. Everyone could go, could do their assessments there. However, we also, the Risk Filter team and the stewardship hubs for water and biodiversity, also provide a bespoke assessments of water and biodiversity, and we could also provide recommendations. So if you're interested, please send us an email. And with this, just to say in these resources, now is again here listed the tutorial page, the risk reports. We have many risk reports that you can go and read. There is also speaking about how to set targets, how we work as well, how is used our work in other information. We also have case studies in case you want to know how we have been working with other companies. And finally, the data and methods link. And don't worry, this is going to be shared, all the materials, the recordings, so then you can have access again to all these resources. And with this, I would like to thank you all, or we would like to thank you all for your attention. And also I would like to leave you with the faces of the whole team, because it's now only the opportunity for Liam and I to present to you. But we also have these lots of experts that are also working together. And I would like to thank you, all of them, for all the work, but also all of you to paying attention and to stay here with us in the webinar. And we still have some minutes to answer some questions that you might have.
Great. So we have a ton of questions flowing in through the chat. So I'll start to pick out some of these and share them with you. First of all, maybe just starting out, why did you do the data updates? And how often are you planning on doing this in the future?
Do you want me to take this one, Isa? Yeah. So in terms of why we did them, I think mostly this was what I covered in the slides at the beginning. So we want to do this for two reasons. Firstly, to integrate user feedback. We get a lot of user feedback through our email, which you can see on the slides here, and also through collaborations we have with other corporate partners. And so this is an opportunity for us to integrate that. And then as a second point, you know, as things change, as we go on, we're getting new data that's being released by academic researchers, by other NGOs, and we wanted to have an opportunity to integrate some of that into our tool to hopefully better reflect the newest state of knowledge. In terms of how frequently, our goal has always been that these updates would happen every 2 years. However, that's an aspirational goal. It may depend a little bit on available data. If there are really important data sets that come out that may need to be included, this could change. But as a rule, we would think to do it every 2 years.
Great, thank you. And Liam, I know you touched on this a little bit before, but I think you mentioned, you know, the results aren't really meant to be comparable. So when taking into consideration the new data sets that have been added, are you advising users to reassess a previous analysis to get a new picture? And what does that tell you about how things have changed over time?
Yeah, so I think it will depend a little bit on where you are in your stewardship journey. So for users that may have already prioritized and are you know, already taking actions, using those previous prioritization results would be our strong recommendation. We don't think it's a good use of your time to go back and reprioritize again because you've already got a strategy in place. The previous results are not wrong. They're just a different version with different data sets. So if you've already got a strategy and prioritization done, then please stick with that. If you're new to using the tool or you haven't yet kind of made final prioritization decisions, then the newer version of the tool would be what you should use, and it's currently the only one available. The older version of the tool is no longer online. So you would be using that going forward. In terms of what changes between the two, so it really depends on which data and category you're looking at. We don't have huge changes in all of them. Some cases you may see that because we've added more data sets, you might get some risk scores that have decreased only because the highest possible risk would be a site that has high risk in every one of the underlying data sets. So now the sites that are flagged as the highest risk may be less frequent. To sum it up, I think it's a thing where there's no consistent increase or decrease in the risk across the tool. It will depend on which data you're working with.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions around this 5,000 site limit in the tool. So this is something that we deal with on a regular basis. Perhaps we can go into a bit more detail here about what the limit is and some of the workarounds that we've developed in the meantime.
So I can start off a bit with this, but maybe Isa would be useful to talk a bit about the workarounds. You have a bit of experience with that. So, as I said, there are two different limits here. One is this geocoding limit, and one is the limit on how many sites can be assessed for one company. The 5,000 site limit for assessments for one company is related to the ability to create the visualizations and the maps that we produce in the end of our output. And having many more sites can make those hard to use, and so this is why we introduced this limit. We have a goal to increase that in the future. That may mean that the data you'll get out will not be in the kind of in the same formatted Excel that you're used to, but it should be something where you can access more risk scores. But that is not yet available. And if you are signed up to our newsletter, if we make these changes in the future, you should be informed about those. In terms of the best way to deal with it, maybe here, Isa, I'll hand over to you to talk a bit about that.
Yes, many thanks, Liam. Well, one of the workarounds that we have is to create different companies. You could create the same name. So it could be company 1, company 1.1, and just add the sites in the two companies. And then when you download the Excel, you will need just to copy and paste them to have it in one same Excel sheet. So this is one option. The limit is not only with the upload, but as Liam said, it's also with the download. That's why we cannot allow to upload more in one company. But then if you create different companies, it's possible then for you to go and paste all the information together. Or you also could create different groups. So if you want, you can also go create different groupings depending what makes more sense for you, and then go and analyze per group and then do the same. Just combine all of them in one Excel or CSV file or anything that makes more sense for you later.
And maybe it's also worth saying that the kind of when we do partnerships with, so this is just related to our free tool, so the tool that you're using online. When we're doing partnerships with corporates, if we establish longer term partnerships, we are able to do assessments on many more sites internally. But these restrictions just apply to the free online version of the tool.
Thanks. We also have a few questions in the chat about what we mean by risk when we're talking about risk. It's a bit of a broader question. So are we talking about financial risk? Are we also looking at risks to nature and to people? And how do we incorporate those kinds of considerations? I'm happy to jump in, but I would hand it over to you guys first.
Maybe I can just quickly go in and then please, Rebecca, complement. Well, when we speak about risk, we are doing nature-related risk, and we try to see it from two angles, if it's depending or impacting. So it's always related only to nature-related risks. And we see it as a probability to be dependent or impacting. That's why we also have these different industry weightings or the operational risk assessment also with the water risk filter. But Rebecca, please feel free to complement.
Sure. So I think any of the risks that are flagged in the tool can become financially material for a company. And so there's, as Isa said, we look at it through the lens of dependencies and through impact. So on dependencies, we're really looking at the ways that companies are depending on nature or natural assets. And when those are in decline, of course, that can create a financial risk for a company. Within regulatory and reputational risk, it's really much more focused on that impact side. So for example, within reputational risk, we have both environmental considerations, so impacts on nature, as well as social considerations and impacts on people. So those kinds of considerations are largely captured through that reputational risk category. So we try and provide a really holistic picture. And again, any of those could become financially material for a company depending on how things go. We have a few more questions about upcoming features of the tool and previous features of the tool. So I think some people are maybe missing the response section of the water risk filter. Some people have asked about regulatory risk in biodiversity. Some people have asked about scenarios in biodiversity. So maybe we could give a quick preview of the things that we are working on and that are coming up in the tool in the near future.
Maybe I can take this one and others jump in if they think there's anything I've missed. So in terms of respond, we have a plan to implement a new part of our tool, which would be called the ACT module. This will include some of the features that you might have seen previously in the water risk filter, but we would intend to bring these in to work with both water and biodiversity. And this would include a range of things. So some of this would be information about opportunities, so locations where you may be able to take actions to respond to the risks that have been identified. Also advice on, say, frameworks or certifications that could be useful given the risks that have been identified. So these are the type of things that we'd integrate into ACT. That is an ongoing project that we're hoping will be available in the coming year or so. In terms of regulatory risk, so this is one where we have a little bit more of a concrete idea of where we're progressing. So we're currently in a collaboration with Legal Atlas to estimate regulatory risk for both water and biodiversity using a standard method. And that will allow us to include regulatory risk into the biodiversity risk filter and also update regulatory risk in the water risk filter and have them aligned to use similar methods in both of those tools. So that's something we're really excited about. And then the final one is scenarios for biodiversity. I don't think we have a strong timeline for if that would be implemented anytime soon. Maybe Rebecca, if you have any other thoughts or ideas. It's a very tricky topic. So it's not something that we currently have in the pipeline, but of course it would be wonderful if we would be able to do that in the future. But right now, it's not upcoming.
Great. We have quite a number of questions about our collaboration with IBAT in the chat. Specifically, how we integrate IBAT data. I think it would be great to touch on what users should do if they have a high risk that's based on IBAT data, and whether we're considering incorporating more of that in the future. Again, I'm happy to supplement, but would throw it over to you, Liam and Isa, first.
I think you go, please, Rebecca.
Sure. So we've been collaborating with IBAT since the very beginning of the biodiversity risk filter, and we do have a number of indicators that are based on IBAT data sets. So for example, protected and conserved areas, key biodiversity areas, we have range rarity in there as well. But we do not show the IBAT data directly. So essentially what we do when you have a high risk rating for a site on those data layers, for example, with protected areas, it shows that you're in a hydroshed with a high coverage of protected areas. It doesn't actually show you whether or not you are in or outside of that protected area. What we recommend that our users do if they have a high risk stemming from IBAT data is actually go to IBAT and run a report and get the detailed site-specific information so that they understand that risk better and they know whether or not they're managing it well. In terms of where we're going with that collaboration, of course, IBAT does have a number of other data sets that we don't have in the tool yet, such as the STAR data set. And we know this is really useful for companies that are going through the SBTN process, for example. So we are in discussions about how we can expand that collaboration and include more data. So keep an eye out for that in the future as well. Next, I think there are a lot of questions about the connections with other frameworks and CSRD and TNFD and using our data in reporting. I know, Isa, you did cover that already, but maybe we could just jump back to it a little bit to give people a bit more information on how far the tool can take them in this process and what other things they might need to do to actually comply with all of these regulatory requirements.
Happy to go through. So Liam, if you could please go back to that slide. I think, remember the number of the slide. Yes, this one. Thanks a lot. So one thing to say, first of all, as a disclaimer, as we already mentioned, the Risk Filter Suite, the Water Risk Filter has been since 10 years ago. Biodiversity was launched 1 year ago. And most of these frameworks, they are still developing and they are still changing. So of course, it's not possible for our tools to fully align with all of them. And also it won't be also possible if we want to align, we will need just to follow one. Therefore, we try to find the alignments where we can. And just to say, for instance, the SBTN is proposing a 5 steps to do the 5 steps approach. However, our tools, because of the type of data we have, can only support step 1 and 2. The step 3 is about metrics and targets. So we have like contextual water targets in the tool. We have other information that you can go and read in the risk reports. And with the ACT module that we want to launch and that we are planning to create, it will help also to this step 4, which is ACT. So once is there and once we find more alignments, of course, we will change the things in the guidance so you know how we can align. And that's why it's very important for you to be always registered to the newsletter. So that is when we inform, when we find new changes or something, because SBTN is also still evolving, so we will need to check. Similarly is when the TNFD. So the TNFD have some specific recommendations. It has sector recommendations. It has also for scenarios. It has different recommendations. However, we acknowledge that our tool can better align with the SLEEP approach. And that's why we are creating where we have metrics that could help in this SLEEP approach. As said before, it's not possible to cover all of them. And this SLEEP approach, it helps also to this disclosure. It has normally a triangle. The TNFD is how it presents like all the documentations. And this SLEEP approach could help to inform the final top of the triangle. However, you will need normally to go to other tools. TNFD focus a lot on financial impact. So at least our tools are helping to identify these state of nature values or these first risk values. And then you will need to find another tools to complement it. And it's the same with the ESRS. We cannot cover all the requirements. We also are a small team and we don't have the capacity to follow all of them in every change they are doing. And that's why we just created the guidances where you can just see where we can align. But this is, of course, always to the criteria of the people working on this, to go and check, review all the data. If you are going to use it for disclosure, please check the data, check with the stakeholders, validate the data, because this also is part of all these steps that all these frameworks are proposing.
Thanks, Isa. We have a few questions on the more kind of practical side when companies are using the tool. Whether they can share assessments within their company, whether it's only visible to the user that's inputted, or whether they can share sites with consultants they're working with or something like that. So maybe you could speak a little bit about how those functionalities work within the tool.
So I can start on this. So there is a functionality to share sites or company information between users. It will require the person that you're sharing it with to have a user account. So that will be a necessary step. Yeah, so we do have a functionality for that included in the tool, and when you're in your portfolio manager, if you've used that before, we have the little ellipses on the side next to sites or companies, and you can click there, and there should be an option there for you to share. So that would be what I would suggest if you want to share this with others that you're collaborating with. Yeah, and maybe an important thing to flag here, it can be useful to share with other team members. Also, to make sure that this site information is easily available within the company. We have had cases before where one person in a team will do all of the work on an account related to their email address, and when they leave, the account is no longer accessible. So it is always good to make sure that you maybe share it with colleagues so it's accessible to other people within your team.
Thanks. We have some questions on water stress as well. So one attendee asks if they want to show water stress, which was previously possible with water scarcity, do they now have to combine water availability and drought in order to be able to show the changes in a comparable way, or can water stress now be shown as water availability?
Isa, do you want to take this?
I can go first,
yeah.
and then yeah, you feel free to complement. Well, previously water scarcity used to include also drought. However, to align better with SBTN, we decided to separate it considering water availability and then drought. But it's important to say that despite we're trying to align with SBTN, we also noticed that groundwater wasn't included, and we also included in our tool. So now the water availability includes the 3 data sets proposed by SBTN plus groundwater, and then we have drought. If you want to report water scarcity, it will be recommended to have a look at both of them and just to use a precautionary approach and just consider the one that is the highest. Because at the moment, if you have the data from before, you can know what was driving this high risk. But now for water scarcity, it will be better to just use this precautionary approach. If it's high, either for drought or water availability, please consider it.
And maybe it's also worth pointing out specifically with this relationship to SBTN. So as I said earlier, we've included the data sets that are relevant or used for assessing water availability in this SBTN unified layer that we created in collaboration with them. And each of those indicators, when you get your risk scores out at the end, you'll also be able to see the indicators for example, blue water scarcity, water depletion, things like this. And our template that we've put in place to convert from the Risk Filter Suite output into the SBTN format, or to complement as much as possible, that will use this information to try and move from the scores that we have in the Risk Filter Suite into scores or information that's useful for SBTN.
Thanks. And maybe we have a couple minutes left, so maybe one more question, whether we are planning on having a paid version of the tool in the future with more bespoke functionalities.
So maybe I can go on that. So yeah, I mean, obviously this tool is created by WWF, we're an NGO, we're providing this for free. We are thinking about ways that we can create other versions of the tool that may help us with covering costs and maintaining the tool into the future. Exactly how that will work is still being discussed, and part of this will depend a bit on the licenses for data use. We use a range of different data sets from a range of different sources. Some of those are made freely available for any purposes. Some of them are a bit more restrictive. So what we're trying to do now is assess which data sets we can use, that could be used in a paid service. We're assessing these type of things, And we're hoping that in the future, we might be able to provide some alternative services for different types of users, and that can help maintain the tool into the future. So it is a consideration. It's an ongoing discussion that we're undertaking.
However, just to say what you flagged before, Liam, if you have any requirement or you want to have a specific risk assessment, or you want to engage in this stewardship journey, either for water or biodiversity, please feel free to write us, because we don't have paid areas in the tool. However, we will provide you bespoke analysis as well.
So I think that's probably it for questions. I know there were a lot of unanswered questions in the chat. Feel free to email our team if there are outstanding issues. And Liam, Isa, I would hand it back over to you to wrap up. Thanks.
Yes, many thanks everyone for being here. Just before we close, just to remind you that we will share the recording with you. We will share the materials. If you have any questions, please write us an email, and all the unanswered questions in the Q&A. Also sorry for the people with the hand up. We didn't have the opportunity to go through. Please type your question in the Q&A, and we will reply to all the open ones in a file with all the materials. So just allow us for some time. Maybe we will do this in 1 or some weeks, but then it's also we have the time to go through all your questions. Many thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for your time.